The median rent of a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, California, is $3,250 today. And this is Renters Matter. I'm Chris Schmidt, and I'm bringing you all the news from a renter's perspective on politics and other happenings in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today we're going to talk a little bit about why I fear the direction of the housing market so much in Cambridge. So for the past 13 years, I've worked in an industry where I have routine contact with folks who work in Silicon Valley, who work in San Francisco, who work in the Bay Area, down to Mountain View, San Jose, etc. Working in the tech industry, I've had a lot of friends who kind of move back and forth from coast to coast, and I've seen a lot of the evolution of housing prices in San Francisco as this has gone on, as I have gone through this. I remember, going out and having a job interview at Yahoo in 2004, flying out there. I have watched some of the evolution of housing prices as I have gone back and forth and traveled to the Bay Area, and seen how things go. And even since 2014, I've been able to watch as pretty much every time I travel to California, which is 2-ish times a year, that I see an evolution in greater homelessness, in greater, people who are underhoused, who are living in RVs, the overall impact on the Bay Area of their housing crisis. And that's one of the reasons why it matters so much to me to try and make sure that Cambridge doesn't go down the same road. I've said before, that one of the things that I think is that overall Cambridge is following very much in the steps of San Francisco on their housing crisis. The only difference is that Cambridge is about 5 years behind on the curve. And so when I talk about the median price of a one-bedroom rental in San Francisco being $3,200, that's about 5 years further down the path of where Cambridge is heading. Overall, in the past 5 years, we've seen rental prices increase by about 50%. If we are to continue along that trend, which is where things are looking at the moment, then we're going to be looking at those kinds of prices by the time 5 years from now comes. That means that every year, on average, one-bedroom apartment rates, costs to rent a one-bedroom apartment are going to go up by about $150 to $200 if we don't change something about the direction we're heading. Now, California has actually just gone ahead and implemented a number of changes in their rental market, which should hopefully head in the direction of kind of staving off this effect. One change that they've implemented that's, a popular buzzword among housing advocates, of course, is rent control. So California recently implemented a rent control law that will cap, I think starting the beginning of next year, will cap rent increases to 5% plus the increase in cost of living, which means that you won't be able to see an individual year's lease go up by more than about 8%, maybe a little bit less, something in that ballpark. But another thing that I think is very important to do with that, and this is what we've seen in a number of places like Oregon, California, as well as other towns that are looking at similar rules changes, is that they've also passed a rule making it effectively legal to convert any single-family property to have 2 additional homes on the property. They've passed an ADU law, an accessory dwelling unit law, that basically means if you do have a single family home, you're able to add 2 more homes to go along with it. And what this means is that in a lot of places that have historically been single family homes only, you might have the opportunity to see more of those turn into places where there are more options for living, where you're not just looking at 3-bedroom, standalone houses, but where you are seeing, backyards or additions converted into additional living spaces. And that new supply has the potential, given that it's a statewide rule, to be a really important part of fighting rising housing costs. The problem that I see with that from the Massachusetts perspective, of course, if I'm looking at Cambridge, is that we're 5 years behind them on the curve, and so if they're doing this now, and we've got 5 years before we get there, that's a real problem. It is interesting to note, though, that Cambridge actually does have an accessory dwelling unit law that was passed earlier this year, that allows any homeowner to, add a new unit in their home and even expand their home to add it so long as they're within kind of the set limits of FAR and so on. Cambridge is one of the denser, urban areas, like denser cities with greater than 500,000 population or something like that. So it's actually a little bit more difficult in most areas of Cambridge to add these homes because so much of Cambridge is already kind of overbuilt by the form that's allowed. You're not allowed to add more square footage to a whole lot of properties in Cambridge, which makes it more difficult to add ADUs. When you have a larger portion of single family homes, this is actually a little bit easier to do because you've got more room on lots and everything else like that. If you looked at West Cambridge, there's a lot of places in West Cambridge where you would actually be able to add more to your property in order to add a second home. If you wanted to build out an extension on your house or something along those lines, because lots are much bigger. Generally in West Cambridge, there's more room for that. But of course, that's also where relatively wealthy single-family homeowners, many of whom have been here for a long time and don't really want to change their homes, live. And so like that's not going to be a solution, is not going to be like targeting the most wealthy area in any given town and saying this is where all the new housing has to go. That's just kind of not how it's going to work. So since the new ADU rules were passed in Cambridge, which only allow one new unit, but allow you to expand your building and everything else like that, I think there's only been one unit created as far as I can tell, only one special permit issued to do that. And of course it still has to go through a special permit process. You have to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals and establish that. So good rule change for Cambridge, but not going to solve the housing crisis on its own. But of course nothing is going to solve the housing crisis on its own. We need to have a whole variety of solutions. And unfortunately for, me who is feeling better at advocating in the municipal space than in the state legislature, I think it's actually going to be very difficult to achieve a lot of goals by fighting this fight only in Cambridge. That doesn't mean I think we should give up in Cambridge. I think Cambridge still has a lot more that it can do, especially because Cambridge is a relatively wealthy city, towards helping support and create infrastructure and create opportunities for expanding housing opportunities in Cambridge. But we can't fix it on our own, and that's what California recognized as well, is that local control was really driving a lot of problems in responding to California's housing crisis. So they moved to the state level. They moved to the state level and passed a statewide rent control bill that established this statewide that have a limit. It's not like what's been proposed or historically been the case in Massachusetts, where each city sets its own rules, but rather a statewide limit. We've seen that they passed a statewide rules change to basically allow 3 units to be developed on any property, and those two things combined, kind of tenant protections and overriding local control to set a minimum standard for what's allowed, create a much broader spectrum of impact, right? That you're not just having this effect in San Francisco, where they similarly have the area of West San Francisco that is single family homes, and an eastern portion that's more dense. But instead, it's also going to apply in Palo Alto. It's going to apply in Mountain View, where looking at a lot of the rentals in Mountain View, actually much more so than in Cambridge, they're actually single family homes. Like right now, if you go rent a 3-bedroom in Mountain View, something along the lines of like 10 to 20% of the rentals there, as far as are listed on Zillow, as far as I can tell, are actually just whole houses. Whereas in Cambridge, that number is minuscule. Is in the single digit percentages, that you might have a dozen of those properties out of 1,800 properties being rented. So there's a lot more opportunity for, in towns that are kind of down the bay in San Francisco, to have those single family home neighborhoods expand and offer more opportunities, converting existing single family rentals to being 2-family or 3-family rentals. And Cambridge has this property that a lot of our housing is more dense, in part because Cambridge was built before zoning. 75% of Cambridge was built before zoning was introduced at all in 1924, and 85% of it was built before kind of our current model of zoning, which was introduced in 1962. And so in that sense, we actually have a lot of buildings that predate some of these more esoteric or exclusionary rules. And that's why it's a little bit more difficult to kind of add incremental housing here. But adding incremental housing is what we need to do, not just in Cambridge, but statewide, in order to respond to our housing crisis. Because while adding many big projects, especially near transit. Taking like the North Station development is an interesting one in Boston, where North Station used to just be the sports arena and the commuter rail stop that came, or the end of the train line that came in. And what we've seen at North Station is this massive development of hotel space, of commercial space, and of housing that has then actually opened up a lot of opportunities right at North Station to have more retail as well. So now there's something like a dozen restaurants as well as a couple of grocery stores at North Station. With this much greater density, you're able to create this little community where you have a whole bunch of the things that you need and access to them right there by creating this kind of dense multi-use environment. And that's great, and we should do that. But in order to add more housing that is priced more towards the middle of the market, we really have to get to the point where we re-legalize the construction of the housing that we are so used to seeing in Cambridge. Because if you look at Cambridge today, 85% of what's here would not be legal to be built again. And that's actually less true in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, because a lot of it was built up after zoning was introduced, after these kind of rules around setting up that, houses should be detached buildings and all this stuff, it means that when you drive through large sections of Bay Area towns, that they are much more detached dwellings. They are much more, house with a lot and a driveway and a yard and all this other stuff that leaves more opportunity there. And this is also true in a lot of areas surrounding the Boston area. Not necessarily in Cambridge, but as you go further out, you will find that more of the homes are homes with yards. When you look at cities like Newton or other areas like that have good transit connectivity, where Newton has 5 different Green Line stops in it, but there's a lot of lots out there that are just very big and have room to add more housing if it was legal to do so. But we have effectively made the construction of the housing that we are used to from walking around Cambridge illegal. Over the past 100 years, we've made it more and more illegal. And that's really something that we're going to have to fix. And California taking that step of legalizing a minimum of 3 units on every lot is, I think, a great step for them. And the fact that it's statewide means that it makes a much bigger difference. The larger an area that you can impact with these things, whether it's impacting all of Boston or impacting Cambridge plus a bunch of surrounding towns, or ideally even impacting statewide, to set minimums on what can be built that matches what people are used to as thinking of good housing. Homes that were triple deckers built in the 1920s and 30s, or sixplexes that you can walk up to and say, oh, look at this cool building that's got 3 levels with 3 apartments on each side. This type of housing is just cannot be built in large chunks of Cambridge, Boston, and bringing that back to the table and opening those doors back up would be a huge win in being able to create more of the housing that people like, rather than having all housing be focused in kind of narrow, small towers near transit that create kind of unaffordable living scenarios, right? This is creating, anytime you're creating a brand new fancy building, it is certainly the case that those buildings cost more to get permitted, cost more to get built. If you're building a high rise, the just costs of building a high rise are just higher, and those are all things that play into the eventual purchase price. If you are able to add these homes in other places, then we can do more. And this is why I say, I have lost friends from Cambridge. I've lost friends from Cambridge who have moved to Austin, who've moved to Seattle, who've moved to Boulder, who've moved to, amusingly, Boulder, which has had a housing affordability crisis since I visited it when I was 12 in, 23 years ago, hearing about Boulder's housing crisis. But even so, it's less expensive than Cambridge and San Francisco are now, that people leave from Cambridge to move to somewhere else. But my friends who are based in San Francisco have had to deal with that even sooner. Where I said, we're in Cambridge, we're looking at $2,300 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. In San Francisco right now, it's $3,200 a month or $3,400 a month for the median one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, and we're on that path, and we've got to figure out how to change something, ideally before we get to that point. Because while we have not changed something, what we will see is that everyone who's renting is going to see their prices continue to increase by about $150 a year, while their pay is going to increase by significantly less than that, unless they're making a massive amount of money. That pay is going up at maybe 2% per year, while rent is going up at 7% per year. And so your relative, amount of pay that you're getting up is getting eaten up more and more and more by your housing costs, and we have to find ways to stop that. And rent control, again, I'm not going to say, negative things about rent control. I think that in the middle of a crisis, using whatever tools are available as a tool to kind of mitigate the short-term harm is valuable. But the reality is that there's going to continue to need to be more people who are going to come here. We continue to see more jobs created in Boston. We continue to see more jobs created in Cambridge. And even if we stopped all permitting of new commercial development in Cambridge, which we should not do for other reasons I'll get into, it would still be the case that we would have a ton of demand from schools, from commercial development in Boston, from overall the switch to a more urban lifestyle being desirable for people. This is not going to go away. Now, the reason I say that we shouldn't just turn off the switch on commercial growth is that commercial growth or changing of ages of buildings or building new buildings to have kind of a variety of ages of buildings is actually one of the ways that you can protect tenants, right? Like in the same way that having old housing and new housing for residents to move into is valuable, having old housing and new housing for retail spaces to move into is valuable, so that you don't just get high-end restaurants, but you can also have more moderate restaurants or fast food places or Goodwill stores that are all going to have that spread of rents that can exist. And I think an example of what we see where we don't have that is Harvard Square, where, for the past many years, it's been very difficult to build in Harvard Square because of the historical preservation aspects of the square. And so very little has been redeveloped. And what we've seen is that a lot of tenants who have come to the end of 5 and 10-year commercial leases are seeing that their leases have gone up significantly in cost and are now kind of moving out. Properties have been bought by, out-of-town developers who come in and take advantage of these kind of tenants who are no longer interested in renewing, buy buildings, take up spaces and convert them to higher end chains, which can bear that cost by effectively subsidizing their Cambridge build by pulling money from other places. Well, if you're just a small shop, if Black Ink only exists here, you've really got to be in a position where when the building you're in wants to increase the rent by 20% or 30% or 50% to match the growth in the rental rate over the past, or of the property value over the past decade, that you're able to have another option. Right? That you're able to go to an older building that maybe is a little bit smaller. You're able to go to a space that's maybe a little more out of the square and make that trade-off. When your vacancy rate is very low, and by, I think, most measures, Cambridge's retail vacancy rate is pretty low, despite people's feelings on vacant storefronts, you don't have that option in the same way that you don't when you have a low apartment vacancy rate, right? Like, I can't just tell my landlord, screw you, I'm going to go and, get a new apartment, because, realistically, what am I going to... There's not a lot of apartments on the market that are going to meet my needs, that if I'm looking to have a 3-bedroom apartment with 4 people and I'm looking for a space that's at least 1,000 square feet, I'm not going to find something for less than what I'm paying now, because there's just no vacancy. And realistically, given that I'm looking off market where everything swaps on September 1st, there's a good chance I won't find anything. That there just won't be places for me to rent. And so that's a real concern that you have to be aware of when you're looking at these opportunities to switch places where you are. If you're a residential tenant, you want there to be more apartments to move to, and if you're a commercial tenant, you want there to be more storefronts for there to move to. So there's currently a zoning petition in Harvard Square to kind of look at allowing more small storefront spaces, allowing more dense buildings to be built, allowing kind of a little bit of step back for some of those historical preservation to maintain the nature of the square, not as like a set of architectural buildings, which is, interesting and all, but if all those architectural buildings are empty storefronts, that's not really interesting to most people. And so you want to do something different than that. And we've seen, the trend in San Francisco of, okay, as things got more expensive, San Francisco has lost a community of artists, has lost a community of, people of color. It has lost a lot of its longtime tenants, despite having rent control. Because as people move on, when someone is no longer in the apartment, now it's back at market rates, and the market rates have just gone up so much that those people, as people move out, new people of the same income or whatever can't move in, and this is a real problem, and it's a real thing that we've seen in Cambridge. We've seen a decrease of overall black population in Cambridge by like 10%, relatively speaking. We've seen declines in art communities. We've seen all these things because Cambridge has become a town that is largely for the wealthy, and we can fix that. We could fix that, but we've got to accept that in order to fix that, we've got to change a lot, and we don't want to go down the road where every year, people get another $150 increase, and can they handle it this time, or do they have to move farther out? We don't want to be in a position where people have to make the choice between kind of living in a rent-burdened way, where they're paying too much of their income on rent, or, being forced to have a worse life. Like, ideally, people could live in Cambridge and pay, less extreme rents. And building more houses is just part of that. But also, finding out how to building more houses in Cambridge is part of that. But building more houses in the entire region and the entire state is going to be part of that as well. And California has done this. Oregon has done this. Have passed these rules that kind of set minimum standards for what housing should be allowed, especially in cities of in Oregon, it's cities of 25,000 people or more. California has been looking at things near transit. In Cambridge, there's the looking at the housing choice bill, which does not take away local control, but allows changes to be made to zoning with just a majority rather than a supermajority. And these things are all really, really important tools to have along the path towards affordability. And we've got to have the ability to have communities kind of drive forward and not have a minority say no, we don't want that, and successfully stall. That we need to bring these things forward together and raise these issues and raise things to the forefront, so that we can say we don't want to go down California's path. We don't want to lose hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands more people out of our city, of our most of our more low income or vulnerable residents, because we didn't want to have backyards have houses in them, or we didn't want to have extra shadows. That is super disappointing. I don't want that. I don't think anybody really sits back and says that they want that. And we've got to figure out how to make living outside of Cambridge more, practical for someone who works in Cambridge. We've got to figure out how to fix transit. We've got to figure out how to, make connections. We've got to figure out how to, have other cities build up commercial bases that will allow them to invest in housing and infrastructure and schools and everything else, to allow them to, create better outcomes for their cities as well. And so when you look at Somerville, which is, I think, even more dense than Cambridge, they're unable to do some of the things that Cambridge is from an infrastructure perspective because they don't have the commercial tax base that we have picked up via the Kendall Square redevelopment. They're at their property tax cap and can't increase property taxes anymore, whereas Cambridge can, as it only 2/3 of its property tax levy cap, but elects not to, and as a result comes back and says, well, we don't have the infrastructure in place, we don't have the money and the time and the whatever to go ahead and redesign some of these things that would make bus lanes more practical, or Mass Ave safer for bikers, or other elements like this. And we should be doing better in Cambridge. But we also need to be looking at how do we create it so that Cambridge isn't bearing all the load. We should carry more, in my opinion, because we are a relatively wealthy town. We are well transit connected. We are directly next to Boston. We do have a responsibility to carry a lot of this for climate reasons and for social justice reasons and for other reasons as well. Like, frankly, we're a great place to live and everyone should be able to live here. But we have to be able to figure out how do we get places which don't have a movement towards building more, that don't have a movement towards getting better access, that don't have these things, are able to get past that. That we need to be able to get past the snobs. We need to be able to get past the people who say no. We need to be able to get past anyone who is kind of against new housing, and be able to get that housing there anyway. Because we're just going to have to do that to match the job growth and the demand, and turning back the clock on growth is just a bad idea. We should not enter a degrowth era. We should not take a step back. We should not say, commercial buildings are not for us. We should encourage growth, but rebalance the outcomes so that everyone benefits from that growth, and not just the wealthiest few, and not just tech workers, and not just this and that city workers can benefit, that your barista can benefit, that everyone can benefit from the overall tide lifting all boats, which is something we're not doing enough of today. I don't want to head down the path of San Francisco. I don't want to lose more of my friends. I don't want to have a situation where I look at something and think that will never be for me, much less for anyone who is less well off than I am. I want to fix that. And I want to follow in the footsteps of California now, not 5 years from now. I'm Chris Schmidt. This has been Renters Matter. Thanks for watching.